Hello fellow Jimi Hendrix enthusiasts, welcome back to my channel. When we think of Jimi Hendrix, we picture blazing guitars, wild stage antics, and of course, untouchable talent. But there's one question: was Jimi Hendrix more than just a symbol of the 60s counterculture? To be exactly, was Jimi Hendrix a commercial success? Now, before we jump into conclusions, yes, of course, commercial success isn't the only measure of Jimi Hendrix's legacy, but it's an important milestone that we are diving in today. So don't worry, in my next two videos, I'll dig deeper into Jimi Hendrix's cultural impact, and in the third video of this series, I'll share my opinion on my favorite Jimi Hendrix recordings. In this video, we are breaking down the numbers, album sales, chart performances, gig earnings, and of course we'll take a look at what all this meant for a 27-year-old man who only had a 4-year career. Let's take a quick look back. Before Jimi Hendrix became a rock god, he grinded it out playing backup for the likes of Little Richard and the Isley Brothers. But everything changed in 1966 when Jimi Hendrix moved to London and formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. That's when things exploded. When his debut album Are You Experienced dropped in 1967, it was a huge game changer. Hendrix's music, blending raw blues with experimental rock, was a massive departure from the mainstream. His management and record label took a huge gamble promoting such an unconventional sound for that time. But the risk paid off big time. Are You Experienced hit number 5 in the US charts and went double platinum. For a debut album, that's a monster success. Now let's dive into the numbers of Jimi's major releases and look at the numbers of Jimi's original albums released during his lifetime. Original sales include physical and digital sales figures through 2021. So Are You Experienced dropped in 1967. It sold 5 million copies in the US alone. And in 2021, it still sold over 100,000 copies. It's still a best-selling album. When it came out, it peaked at number 2 in the UK charts, and as I mentioned before, it peaked at number 5 in the US charts, and it spent 76 weeks in the US top 40. Its follow-up album, Aches Is Bold As Love, also dropped in 1967, so this means Jimi Hendrix published 2 albums in 1967 in 1 year, and that's a massive load of work. And Aches Is Bold As Love hit number 5 in the UK chart and number 3 in the US charts. Overall, it spent more than 16 weeks in the UK and the US charts. And on Aches Is Bold As Love, there was no major hit single like on Are You Experienced, but nonetheless, the album sold over 4 million copies worldwide. So after Aches Is Bold As Love, Electric Ladyland came out, and that was in 1968. And Electric Ladyland actually was Hendrix's only number 1 album in the US. It sold over 3.5 million copies there domestically and over 7 million copies worldwide. Tracks like All Along the Watchtower and Voodoo Child's Slight Return of course fueled its success. Reading books or press articles or listening to interviews with record labels, they always state that Jimi Hendrix had a short career and he only published 3 albums. So he only had 3 official album releases. It's factually correct, but I think it's very important to integrate the Band of Gypsys live album. Why is that so? Well, the album came out in May 1970 and Jimi was still alive, so that's an important part of his catalog. The album peaked at number 5 in the US charts and it sold more than 4 million copies. So if we accumulate the numbers, these 4 albums in total sold nearly 27 million copies. It's definitely an impressive number, but there's definitely more to the story, and we are talking about that in a second. Let's now have a look into Jimi's original single sales too. We'll focus on Jimi's 4 most successful singles and we'll check the numbers through 2021. In the 60s, it was pretty common for people to buy singles and not everyone always bought an artist's full album. So we have Hey Joe, and Hey Joe sold 670,000 copies and it peaked at number 6 in the UK charts. Then we have Purple Haze. Purple Haze sold almost 1 million copies. It sold 935,000 copies and it peaked at number 3 in the UK charts. And also All Along the Watchtower was a huge success. The single sold 1,040,000 copies and it charted at number 5 in the UK and number 20 in the US charts. And then we have Voodoo Child Slight Return, and it sold 645,000 copies and it peaked at number 1 in the UK. I know there were some couple more singles, but I wanted to focus on the real successful ones. So in total, that's a number of 3,290,000 physical singles, and if we include Burning of the Midnight Lamp and The Wind Cries Mary and some other singles, that's even more. But as I mentioned before, that's a focus on the real successful ones, and we are talking about the total numbers in a second. Let's now talk about total sales numbers. And these numbers originate in '66 when it all started with the first singles, and they go through 2021. And we have looked at the original sales of the singles and of the original albums, and what we do now is we will add the posthumously released albums and compilations and everything that came there. And further, we will add sales that went across by audio and video streaming. The concept that is applied to determine the total sales is called the commensurate sales to popularity concept, in short CSPC. And this concept is able to translate all forms of consumption into concrete album sales. I don't want to go too much into detail here right now. It's a little bit like math, but if you are interested in that topic and you want to know more, I have put a link in the description that you can follow that. And according to this concept, Jimi Hendrix has moved over 105 million albums globally. And I think this is really an impressive number for someone who has only released 3 official studio albums and 1 live album during his lifetime. So now that we have talked about these impressive numbers, what did they really mean for Jimi Hendrix? And to be exact, what did the sales numbers really mean during his lifetime? And here is an impressive fact. His 3 officially released studio albums are all in the top ranks of the most successful albums of the entire 60s. And this is how successful Jimi Hendrix already was during his lifetime, and this is how impactful his music was. So it was already pretty satisfying to see how successful my favorite artist Jimi Hendrix really was. And that is only from a commercial point of view. But I wanted to know how Jimi Hendrix stack up with other artists. And I wanted to compare Jimi Hendrix to another artist from the 27 Club. If you don't know what the 27 Club is, the 27 Club is a club, or that's just a definition for people who died when they were 27 years old, like Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Robert Johnson, and many more. And Amy Winehouse and Kurt Cobain wouldn't have been a good comparison because those artists already benefited from modern marketing machinery, and especially Amy Winehouse benefited lots from the digital transformation. And I went with The Doors and Jim Morrison especially because both artists had a very short career. And I also thought that the challenge would be greater, would be bigger, because the Doors were a tiny bit more mainstream than Jimi Hendrix. Let's compare the original album sales. We have 27 million albums sold by Jimi Hendrix versus 47.68 million albums by the Doors. But the Doors brought out double the amount of albums during Jim Morrison's lifetime compared to Jimi Hendrix. So they brought out 6 albums and Jimi Hendrix only 3 official studio albums, and then adding the Band of Gypsys album as a 4th album. If we take a look at the top 3 singles by both artists, by Jim Morrison and the Doors and Jimi Hendrix, we have a total of 2.6 million physical singles sold by Jimi Hendrix versus 6.3 million units sold by the Doors. But we shouldn't forget that the Doors had 2 #1 smash hits in the US, and that was Hello, I Love You and of course Light My Fire. Those were massive hits. So let's do the CSPC comparison between the Doors and Jimi Hendrix, and the CSPC is the total sales. That's what I have just explained. And we have to be fair. I mean, if you listen to the radio, especially here in Germany, where radio stations are sometimes still very conservative, you hear songs like Light My Fire way more often than Hey Joe. So this is what I meant with the challenge from the mainstream point of view. But however, here are the numbers. We have 105 million albums sold in total by Jimi Hendrix versus 114.8 million albums by the Doors. And I think that really shows Jimi Hendrix's staying power. It underlines his timeless legacy, and it shows how commercially successful Jimi Hendrix is in comparison to a more mainstream artist of the same era. But we shouldn't forget that especially the Hendrix estate does some really strong posthumous marketing, and they are very active until today. There's still one question that remains. How wealthy, how rich was Jimi Hendrix during his lifetime? And I've heard sources that claim that Jimi Hendrix was the highest paid act during 68 and 70. At the Isle of Wight festival, Jimi Hendrix was paid $43,200, and this translates into $350,000 today. And that's more than double what The Who earned at this festival. Let's take a look at Woodstock. At Woodstock, Jimi Hendrix was the highest paid artist, and he earned $18,000. And $18,000 translates into $163,000 today. Just for comparison, at that festival at Woodstock, Santana earned $750. Janis Joplin was paid $7,500, and Joan Baez was paid $10,000. You might also ask yourself if Jimi Hendrix made money from merch sales. Well, in the 60s, selling merch wasn't a big thing. You know, the whole scene was kind of convinced that selling merch was uncool. And from a technical point of view, all these color plotters weren't where they are today. And selling t-shirts wasn't that easy. So actually, what Jimi Hendrix did was he sold concert programs, but he didn't make the big money out of it. Okay, another point is real estate. Sometimes I hear people claim that Jimi Hendrix had houses and cars and apartments. Well, Jimi Hendrix was a traveler. He kind of lived out of the suitcase, and he never earned a house or an apartment. Well, when he came to London, they rented a beautiful apartment for Jimi Hendrix. And if you go to London, you can visit that apartment. And in his later years, just prior to his death, when he built the Electric Lady Studios, he rented a huge apartment in New York. But both apartments were rented. It wasn't Jimi Hendrix's real estate. At the end of his life, what did Jimi Hendrix really have? Well, actually, he had 600 British pounds in his bank account, and that's around 8,000 pounds today. Jimi Hendrix definitely was a victim to bad management. You've all heard the stories about his management being tied to the mafia and about corruptness and all that stuff. But that's only one part of the story. And the other part is that Jimi Hendrix was a young man earning lots of money. And he was spending it. I mean, Jimi Hendrix bought lots of stuff and he gave money to people around him. And, you know, he built the Electric Lady Studios. That was a huge investment for Jimi. So in the end, if we just take a look at his bank account with the 600 pounds, Jimi Hendrix died a poor man. And after his death, many years after his death, his family really had to go through some struggles to get all the rights back together and to get the earnings together. So from a financial point of view, Jimi Hendrix wasn't a success, but from a cultural and artistical point of view, we know that he was a huge success. So friends, if you like this video, then just like this channel, like this video, subscribe to my channel, or consider becoming a channel member. And well, I really would like to hear what you think about Jimi Hendrix's career, about his success. And I see you in the next video where we talk about Jimi Hendrix's cultural impact, his cultural success. See you next time. Keep on rocking, keep on practicing. Take care. Bye.